"I'm starving for a man's touch," the giant Apache girl said. The Lone Farmer. Best Wild West Stories. Elijah Crowner had lived so long with silence that even the sound of another person breathing felt like thunder to his senses, and that was why, when he first saw the collapsed figure near the cracked riverbed, his hand moved to his rifle before his heart even tried to understand what his eyes were seeing. Because in the Wild West, mercy was often a slower form of death, yet something about the girl's size, the broken iron cuffs around her wrists, and the way her body still tried to rise, even as it failed, stopped him in place, like the land itself had whispered a warning not to turn away. And when she lifted her head with blood at the corner of her mouth and eyes still burning despite exhaustion, he saw not a threat, but a storm that had already been caged once and would never survive it again. And so he dismounted despite every instinct he had sharpened through loss and distance, lifting her with effort into his saddle when she could no longer stand, and riding back to a life he believed had room for nothing unexpected. And through the long route to his farm she drifted, in and out of consciousness, murmuring words in a language shaped by mountains and fire. And when at last the cabin came into view and he helped her down onto his porch, she spoke clearly for the first time and told him her name was Naya, and that she had been stolen, sold, and displayed like a creature instead of a woman, because men feared what they could not own and profited from what they did. And Elijah said very little because his past had trained him that words were luxuries. Yet her presence unsettled the careful emptiness he had built around his life, and in the days that followed he treated her wounds in silence while she watched him, not with fear but with steady curiosity, as if studying whether kindness was real or merely another disguise. And when her strength returned, she surprised him by rising before dawn to help with work, without being asked, lifting sacks meant for two men, repairing fences with quick learning hands, and moving through the land as if it recognized her rather than resisted her. And with each shared task, the distance between them shifted from necessity to awareness. And one night, as the stars cut sharp above the cabin, she finally spoke the truth that had followed her since captivity, telling him that chains did more than bruise the body. They starved the soul of choice and the skin of meaning, and that what she feared most was not being hunted again, but being left to fade without ever being touched as a person, rather than an object. And the raw honesty in her words struck Elijah deeper than any blade, because he had buried the same hunger under years of isolation, convinced that wanting was weakness. And from that moment they lived in a quiet tension neither would name out loud, an awareness built from shared glances, pauses held too long, and nights where sleep came loaded with unspoken questions. Yet danger had not vanished simply because refuge had been found. And when Elijah spotted distant riders moving along the ridgeline one evening with the unhurried certainty of men who owned the land through fear, he understood that the past Naya had escaped was not finished claiming its due. And when he told her what he had seen, she did not tremble or beg as they expected. From those taught submission, she stood straight and asked for a weapon, and his hesitation lasted only a heartbeat before he realized he was not protecting her by denying her a choice, but repeating the very theft of agency she had fled. And as he placed the rifle in her hands and taught her the mechanics of survival, with grim calm, the air between them shifted from quiet refuge to shared defiance. And when night came, they did not speak of hope or fear, only of where they would stand if the men arrived, not as farmer and runaway, not as savior and burden, but as two lives choosing not to be separated by fate's convenience anymore. And as the dark stretched forward thick with waiting, each understood that the desert had tested them alone before, but now it was testing what they would become together. The riders arrived with dust wrapped around them like a crown of arrogance, moving with the careless confidence of men who had never been forced to doubt their ownership of bodies or land. And while they expected fear to answer their presence, they were met instead by gravity, by the stillness of two figures already planted in resistance. And when the first shouted demand tore through the space between them like a whip, Naya did not flinch and Elijah did not lower his aim, because both had learned in different ways that surrender only delayed the wound and never erased it. And when the first shot rang out, it was not born of panic but of decision, and the world shattered into thunder and motion as hooves tore at the earth and bullets split the air. And Naya moved through the chaos with the clarity of someone who had imagined this moment 1,000 times in the dark. Her strength no longer a spectacle, but a weapon reclaimed by purpose, and Elijah fought beside her not as rescuer but as equal, guarding her movement, trusting her angles, and in the violent exchange something more than survival was being defended. And when the dust finally settled, the men who had come to reclaim property lay scattered across the land that had always promised only consequence. Yet victory carried no celebration, because the Wild West never allowed justice to exist without witnesses that demanded payment. And within days the law came not with concern for chains or scars, but with questions, framed by ownership papers and dead bodies. And Elijah was offered a narrow mercy shaped as betrayal, a path where he could step away untouched. If he returned what the world insisted was never truly free, and the weight of that choice bent something inside him, because every part of his past urged him toward the old, familiar loneliness that kept survival simple and clean. Yet when his eyes met Naya's, he saw not accusation but quiet certainty. And in that steadiness he recognized the truth he had been fearing since the moment he lifted her from the desert, that he no longer wished to survive untouched. And before he could speak, she stepped forward on her own, declaring her freedom before men who had never believed it existed. Without permission, and the room shifted with a tension not born of fear but of a truth, spoken too openly to be ignored. And the decision that followed was not justice but compromise, shaped by whispers of unrest and the unwillingness of authority to ignite conflicts that could no longer be controlled so easily, leaving them released but marked, warned not by law but by implication that survival would forever walk beside uncertainty. And in the days that followed, the farm returned slowly to its rhythm, with hands that now worked knowing what loss truly cost. And in the quiet spaces between labor and rest, something changed between them, not as a sudden claiming but as a gradual release of guarded distance. And when at last they stood face to face without the tension of pursuit between them, the silence they shared was no longer heavy but open. And when Naya reached for Elijah's hand, it was not as a plea or a necessity, but as a choice offered freely, for the first time in her life. And in that moment he understood that the hunger she had once spoken was no longer an emptiness seeking to be filled, but a warmth that existed because it no longer feared being taken away. And the land that had once shaped each of them through loss now bore witness to something quieter and rarer, a connection not forged through possession or rescue, but through shared survival. And though the world beyond their horizon remained loud with conflict, greed, and pursuit, what they built at the edge of it was not a fairy tale or a victory carved in legend. It was simply a life made from two histories that chose not to run anymore. And in that choice lay a kind of freedom, stronger than any chain break could ever grant. A freedom that did not erase the scars of what had been, but allowed something new to grow, without asking permission from the past. Time did not soften the world beyond the farm, but it reshaped how Elijah and Naya stood within it. And that difference became visible long before danger returned in physical form, because stories traveled faster than riders, and soon whispers of a farmer who defied traders and a giant Apache woman who would not be reclaimed began drifting through distant towns and camps. And Elijah sensed the shift in the way strangers watched him when he rode for supplies, and Naya felt it in the way fear had replaced hunger in the eyes that once measured her worth. Yet inside the borders of their land, something steadier had taken root, a quiet certainty built from shared labor, shared silence, and a trust that no longer needed hesitation. And still the past was not finished with them, because one evening, a rider arrived with warning rather than threat, carrying word that a larger force was forming beyond the ridge, not only traders but men driven by pride and profit who could not accept that a woman had crossed a line they believed permanent. And the knowledge settled between Elijah and Naya without panic, only resolve. And that night they spoke more openly than ever before. Elijah of the family he had lost and the years he had spent hiding inside survival. Naya of her people, her stolen youth, and the strength that captivity had nearly buried but never destroyed. And from those truths something fully settled into place between them, not as desperate need but as chosen bond. And in the days that followed they prepared quietly, Elijah fortifying what the land allowed, Naya reaching through forgotten channels of kinship that the traders had never understood. And when movement finally stirred, At the edges of the horizon, it was not only enemies who answered the gathering storm, and the confrontation that followed did not arrive as sudden chaos but as a collision of will and history. And when it passed, the land was left heavier with memory but lighter with threat. And as the quiet returned, Elijah and Naya stood not as escapee and protector, but as equals who had faced the weight of the world without retreat, understanding that their future would never be untouched by danger but would always be shaped by choice rather than fear, and in that knowing something enduring finally took root.